Jack Rakove, when did you first know that you were going to get a Pulitzer Prize for your book?
I only really knew when when my editor, Jane Garrett, called me from New York and told me I had in fact won it. There were a couple inklings around Stanford because in fact there was someone at Stanford who's part of the Pulitzer board and who knew in advance and had told a couple people in the press office to start getting ready. And I'd had a couple calls, which got me thinking because I knew the announcement was coming that afternoon. But it wasn't the same thing as actually hearing it in a reliable way.
What did it mean when you did hear?
Well, it's meant a number of things when I heard it, and ever since. It's meant a kind of great sense of satisfaction for a project for which, in fact, I did have high hopes all along. From the start when I wrote this book, I hoped it would be a major book on the Constitution. It means a kind of tremendous sense of confirmation that the project you thought or hoped would pan out, would really make a difference in terms of scholarship and a public understanding of the Constitution. Really seems to have had that effect, and that people who weren't really experts in this subject could pick up your book and find it accessible and find it important. So there's a kind of deep sense of confirmation, a deep sense of satisfaction that comes out of all this.
The most unusual thing I found in your book was a footnote. On chapter 5, the first footnote, and I'll read it. I'm grateful to Mr. Daniel Rakove for counting the number of stairs during a visit to the State House on May 30th, 1993. Who is Daniel Rakove, and where were the stairs?
Well, Daniel Rakove is my younger son. I mean, now in 8th grade or finishing 8th grade in a couple of weeks at the J.L. Stanford Middle School in Palo Alto. And I took him along with me in 1993 for my 25th college reunion at Haverford, which is out on the main line, suburban Philadelphia. And on the way back to Washington, where we were staying with friends, we popped into the State House to take a kind of quick tour. And if you go upstairs from the main floor where the convention was, where the convention met, when the convention met, it displaced the Pennsylvania Assembly towards the end of its deliberations.
You're talking about the Pennsylvania meeting, ratification.
The Pennsylvania State, the Constitutional Convention met in Independence Hall, which is also the Pennsylvania State House, which was also where the Pennsylvania Assembly met. And so the convention was sitting there from May to September 1787, and towards the end of that period, the Pennsylvania Assembly, the state legislature for Pennsylvania, was also due to meet. And so at the very end of the convention, literally as the convention adjourns, one of the Pennsylvania delegates, Thomas Fitzsimons, a Scots-Irish immigrant merchant, literally gathers up his papers and goes dashing upstairs to the second floor where the Pennsylvania Assembly was already in session. He wanted to get the ball rolling right off the bat for ratification, to get the ratification process underway, to have the Assembly agree to call an election for delegates to the special convention that each state was supposed to hold. At least that's what the framers wanted. So we were there, and I guess I think I probably had the idea already for having that little vignette to open the chapter. So I said, well, Dan, who was a bit younger at the time and would get into the spirit of things, why don't you just count the number of steps, all the way up, and and so I put it in. And of course, since he'd done the work, I felt he deserved the credit.
And he counted 42 steps.
I hope he was right.
Go to that May meeting in 1787 of the Constitutional Convention. How many delegates were there?
Well, they kind of come straggling in. There are 55 delegates who attend at one time or other over the course of the convention. There are 42, coincidentally, same number of steps, who are there on the last day, September the 17th, of whom 39 sign. And then some others leave before the convention's quite done. Two of the New Yorkers leave, later Anti-Federalists, Yates and Lansing. Luther Martin, another Anti-Federalist, leaves. And some other delegates go back and forth for personal reasons. George Wythe from Virginia, who had been Jefferson's mentor as a law student back at William and Mary. Wythe leaves early, if I remember correctly, I think because his wife was ill, and so on. So basically you're talking about a group of, you start with 55, you have 42 left at the end. Some are coming and going. Some occasionally take leaves of absence, like Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, and come back. And then of that group, about 15 or so are the real active speakers, and the others are either sitting on their hands or can't quite muster the temerity to actually say something.
Was there ever a day like we see on the floor of the House and the Senate where there were very few members there?
No, not really. I mean, once the convention musters a quorum, it took a couple weeks past the appointed time, or the better part of a fortnight after the appointed time. Once the convention musters a quorum, then it's in pretty regular session. I mean, the Continental Congress used to have real problems in the 1780s maintaining a quorum. For weeks and sometimes months at a time. It was a real struggle for the Congress. But no, once the convention finally gets together in late May, it's, you know, there's a critical mass there day in and day out.
Let me ask you about yourself before we talk more about your book.
Sure.
Where do you reside? You say Palo Alto. What do you do for a living?
Well, actually, I'm a professor of history and by courtesy of political science at Stanford University, where I've taught since 1980. We live on the Stanford campus, which is in its own way kind of a paradise. I think of myself as a fairly committed teacher, pretty extensively involved in undergraduate matters at all levels from freshman on up, and of course I teach a couple graduate courses.
What do you teach?
Well, typically I teach early American history, and for me at Stanford we have a somewhat skewed distribution on the American history side. We have about 10 Americanists, and I'm basically holding everything down from 1607 or earlier, you know, from Jamestown or earlier, down to about 1830. But typically I teach the first part of the American History Survey. The last few years, though not this year, I've taught the freshman, part of the freshman history course, which is part of Stanford's famous Culture, Institutions, and Values, used to be known as Western Civ program. I'll teach small group classes on the Constitution or early American history, and next year I'm going to start teaching a course on the Constitution and race.
Where'd you grow up?
I'm a Chicagoan. I'm a native Cook County Democrat, proud of it.
What area of Chicago?
Well, which area? Several. I mean, I was born at the university. I lived in Austin, which is on the west side, and then when I was about 8 or 9 and my dad was finishing his doctorate at the University of Chicago, we moved back down to Hyde Park. He had a job in Gainesville, Florida, which he didn't like very much for a year in the university, and so we came back to Chicago, and I finished elementary school, which goes through 8th grade in Chicago at the Gale School in Rogers Park, which is the far north side. And then my parents wanted me to have the advantage of a high school education in the suburbs, so we moved to Evanston, which my dad hated, but had great schools. So,
where does the name Ray Cove come from?
Well, that's a good question. It's a somewhat abridged version of our patronymic, which was Rakowski. My grandparents all immigrated in the United States in the early part of this century, from mostly around what's known as Kovner or Kovno or Kaunas in Lithuania, and then my grandmother came from Suwałki in Poland. My paternal grandparents actually went to Minnesota, so the original Rakowski, after whom I'm named, Jacob or Yakov Rakowski, was an iron miner up in the Mesabi Range in the early 20th century, and then later they moved to Chicago, where he was a railroad yard worker. And my grandmother was a piece worker in the, you know, textile in the schmata trade, and you know, in the cloth trade, and I guess when they moved to Minnesota, I think she had a candy store. And then my mother's parents, not quite clear what they did. I mean, I think as my mom says, my grandfather was the kind of guy who mostly hung out in the shul, you know, hung out in the synagogue, the temple most of the time. Not clear he really had much of a productive existence, but you know, he had a large family.
What about your parents?
Well, my dad taught political science at the University of Illinois in Chicago for a long time. He was actually fairly well known in Chicago circles as a political commentator. He had some ties to the older Daily Machine. Wrote a couple books on Cook County politics. Well, one is a kind of standard analysis of Cook County politics called "Don't Make No Waves, Don't Back No Losers," and then the second is an oral history of the Daily years under a title he got from a story that Ab Mikva, you know, the former judge and White House counsel and Chicago congressman, used to tell. And that goes under the title "We Don't Want Nobody, Nobody Sent."
What's his first name?
My dad's first name was Milton Rako.
Can you remember the first time you ever cared or thought or knew anything about the Constitution?
Well, I think the earliest memory that matters is when I was the one year my dad taught at the University of Florida. He wasn't very happy there, but I was. I was a 5th grader in the J.J. Findley School, and our class project was to do a book on what we called a book, essentially, I suppose, a collection of cribbed encyclopedia articles on the history of the American Revolution, for which I was the editor. I still vaguely remember doing pieces on the Continental Congress and the Boston Committee Correspondence. The Continental Congress is the subject of my first book. So I don't know if fifth grade is destiny, but it would run back at least that far, and probably since I was reading history from a fairly early point, even further.
If you could meet any one of these 55 or the 42 or the 39 that signed it or whatever, which one would you want to meet and why?
Well, since you've read the book, you probably know the answer to the question already. Would be James Madison. I'm well known in kind of scholarly circles as a Madisonian of sorts, and I'm a Madison biographer as well. Madison is, to my way of thinking, the most important of the framers in terms of the crucial role he plays at each of the major points in the whole process of calling the convention, framing the Constitution, ratifying it, deciding whether or not it makes sense to add a Bill of Rights to it, and then seeing what it means in practice. And he's also the most important point of entry, I think would be the right term, for us today, let's say for modern commentaries on the Constitution. We rely to an extraordinary extent on Madison for our basic insights into the original theories and ambitions of the Constitution.
What did he do? And what are if you were to list the 4 or 5 important things he did in the process of getting to the Constitution, what were they?
Well, you'd have to start by saying that Madison, with some misgivings, is one of the handful of crucial actors who decides it's necessary, although dangerous, to have a constitutional convention in the full, complete, ambitious sense of the term to begin with. There had been a strategy for trying to reform the Articles of Confederation in the 1780s, and there was a kind of very piecemeal process in which the Congress would propose individual amendments to particular states, to all the states, which would have to agree unanimously. And of course that process always comes a cropper because you can never surmount the unanimity hurdle. So at some point Madison and a handful of like-minded people decide that even though they think the political odds are against them, to in effect to go for broke and to risk having a general constitutional convention in the hope that having a fresh agenda will somehow free up the logjam of constitutional reform. So that's step number one. Step number two is Madison goes into the convention having prepared himself in a kind of very characteristic way, very carefully, very, very deeply, having read deeply and thought even more deeply about the fundamental problems, both of the Articles of Confederation, the state constitutions, and also to some extent the lessons of history. And on that basis, and really on the basis of his own experience as a legislator, both in the Continental Congress and in Virginia, I think Madison understood the importance of trying to frame, if not control, the agenda. That's why there was a Virginia plan. Partly it's because the other delegates haven't shown up. And the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians are sitting around in Philadelphia waiting for the other delegations to appear, and they might as well do something. So they framed the Virginia plan. So in a sense, there's a kind of accidental quality to this, but at a deeper level, Madison was really well aware of the importance of having some set of proposals, pre-packaged, so to speak, to get the deliberations going, to which others would have to react.
How old was James Madison in 1787?
Well, he's just turned 36 when the convention comes to order. Well, Madison's birthday is sometime in March. I should know the exact date and can't quite remember.
How old was Alexander Hamilton when?
Oh, that's a little bit more questionable. There's some dates about Hamilton's exact birth date. Hamilton's about 3 or 4 years younger, so Hamilton's still in his early 30s.
So there they are early on, and there's something called the Virginia Plan. Give us a couple of things that made the Virginia Plan important.
Well, I think the most important thing is that anybody reading the Virginia Plan or hearing it read as it was first announced by Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, would understand that it was, in effect, calling for an abandonment to the existing structure of the Confederation. I think a number of the delegates going into the deliberations probably would have expected that the convention's business would have been confined to proposing some additional set of powers that could be safely vested in the existing unicameral Continental Congress. Madison's proposals as they're embodied in the Virginia Plan, or Madison's scheme as it's embodied in the Virginia Plan, basically calls for creating a fully articulated national government. That's to say, a national government with 3 independent, constitutionally established branches, with the authority to legislate, to execute, to adjudicate its own laws, and therefore not to have to rely on the states, as Congress had to do under the Articles of Confederation. And that was about as fundamental, one could say as wrenching, a transposition as one could have imagined. So I think right from the get-go, it's clear that what the Virginians are proposing, what Madison is actively advancing, is not simply tinkering with or amending or strengthening the Articles of Confederation, but starting out with a freshly conceived government with powers that would go far beyond what the Continental Congress had ever been able to exercise.
Let me ask you about the country at that point. How many states were there in the Union? Or how many states were there in the United States?
Well, there are 13 in the Union and 14 if you want to call Vermont. Vermont is actually kind of an independent republic through much of this period. And some of the states are on the verge of breaking up, in the sense of Virginia certainly getting ready to slough off Kentucky as an independent, as an additional state. But so
how many people in the country?
Well, the first census, which is done under the Constitution, which is actually the first really reliable estimate we have, it gives you a fraction over 3 million, of whom I think about 500,000 to 600,000 would have been African Americans.
And where was the Continental Congress headquartered?
Well, where wasn't it headquartered? It had been in Philadelphia for most of the Revolution, but then it had occasionally had to go on holiday to Baltimore and York when the British get too close. And then in 1783, there was a kind of ugly incident with the Pennsylvania militia, and Congress takes Pennsylvania soldiers complaining about having their wages not be paid. So Congress takes umbrage to this. It goes off to Princeton, which was too small, in the summer of 1783, and then goes on to Trenton, which, then and out didn't have the greatest press, and eventually, I take that back. No, first goes Philadelphia, Princeton, Annapolis. It reconvenes in Trenton late in 1784, doesn't like it, goes on to New York, and stays in New York until, through the first session of the new Congress in 1789.
How many of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention also were members of the Continental Congress?
Well, that's a good question, which I can't answer exactly. I mean, a fairly substantial number had been, but I can't give you the exact number. Some were concurrently members. I think something like 10 of the delegates were simultaneously eligible to sit in the Continental Congress, and in fact, as soon as the convention adjourns, led by Madison, they hie their way back to New York, because New York was the first stopping point for the Constitution on its road to the states. That's to say, the convention wanted the Congress to give a kind of imprimatur, kind of its kind of seal of approval to the Constitution without tampering with it, and then send it on to the state legislatures, which in turn would call the state ratification conventions, which in turn would represent the sovereign people whose approval would make the Constitution supreme law.
By the way, was Vermont represented at the...
No, Vermont's not part of the Union.
Not part of the Union, so they didn't have any delegates to the
No
convention.
delegates. And the other state that's not represented is Rhode Island.
Ever?
No, Rhode Island throughout the 1780s had pursued what's sometimes characterized as an anti-federal, anti-unionist policy. Rhode Island had always been known as kind of an outlier. It's sometimes described as the home of Jews, Turks, and infidels because of its history of religious toleration, but that kind of characterizes that kind of captures its kind of position as a kind of quintessential dissenting community. So Rhode Island had been anti-federal all along, and Rhode Island doesn't bother to send a delegation to Philadelphia. And that actually has important implications for how the framers thought about the process of ratification.
And which of the 13 states was the largest?
Virginia's the most populous. Pennsylvania second. Massachusetts is the third.
Were the delegates proportional?
Well, the delegations vary in size, but that didn't really matter because at an early point, after a little discussion, the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians, at the point when they're waiting for the other delegations to show up, they discuss what should the rule of voting be in the convention. In the Continental Congress, the rule of voting was one state, one vote, regardless of population. And Madison and the Virginians and the Pennsylvanians were intent on changing that rule of voting in Congress, in both houses, for the new legislature they wanted to create. And the issue arose, would they also want to make the same demand for the convention itself? Would they want to have some scheme of proportional voting for the convention itself? But Madison and the Pennsylvanians say, let's force this issue at the start, Madison and the Virginians say, no, it's better off if we kind of preserve the existing rule and try to convince the small states to give up their equal vote as we go along. So it's one state, one vote, and the delegations vary in size, up to about 6-7 members in the case of Pennsylvania.
What almost did we get in that Constitution?
What do you mean? What almost did we get?
That either lost by a vote or was ready to be passed and they derailed it at the last minute. What could have changed?
Actually, some of the most important aspects of the Constitution were decided by very narrow margins. I think the one that I try to emphasize in the book, because in some ways I still find it offensive today, is what's known as the so-called Great Compromise, or occasionally misnamed Connecticut Compromise, which gives each state an equal vote in the Senate and thereby preserves that, at least to some extent, that rule of voting from the Continental Congress. That's the principal issue that perplexes the convention from almost the first week of deliberation down to July 16th, which is the day the so-called compromise is approved. And it's approved by the narrowest margin. It's basically approved. It's approved by a margin of 5 states to 4, with 1 divided. And Massachusetts, which was a large state and had always voted with the large states, and therefore against equal state representation in the upper house as well as the lower house, Massachusetts divides. Elbridge Gerry and Caleb Strong take the Massachusetts decide on the basis of compromise to side with the small states. And so therefore Massachusetts loses its vote. Tie vote in effect is discounted. Or in this case, it means you have a majority, 5 to 4, with 1 divided, to carry the so-called Great Compromise. It's about the narrowest victory possible, and that's really the basic reason we have, as I like to tell my students, ask yourself the question, why does Wyoming have 2 senators and California have 2 senators? It's a good question. So that's certainly one issue. There are a couple other issues. Some of Madison's pet proposals are, especially the one to give Congress a negative on all state laws, which certainly would have made a major difference in the convention. That's a proposal that's originally approved, then rejected after the Great Compromise, and then brought back fairly late in the convention. And at that point, there's a vote to commit, and Madison has to say to send it to committee, but not to bury it, but to kind of refine it and bring it back. And that one's lost, I think, by 4 to 3, with I think 2 states divided.
If you happened on a group of, in those days, outside of the debate in the Constitutional Convention, and you found them socializing, give us clumps of people you'd find together.
Well, that's a tough one because we don't really know all that much about what went on after hours. Though there are a couple delegates' diaries which occasionally give you a little insight into that. I mean, we know at one point in Washington, when the Committee of Detail was meeting in late July and early August, and the convention's in a state of semi-adjournment, Washington goes fishing with the Morrises, Robert and Gouverneur.
Are they related, the Morrises?
No, but they're very close. They're very close. They're not related, but they're very close politically. So imagining how they socialized after hours, that's tough.
Or if not socializing, who would you find really close? Who would be around James Madison? Say he said, all my friends come over here in the corner, we want to chat. Who would they be?
Well, I think probably the most interesting one to speculate about would probably have been James Wilson, Wilson's a very powerful legal mind, a Philadelphian, a Scots immigrant, a lawyer, later serves on the first Supreme Court. Very much of an elitist in his politics, especially in Pennsylvania, which had very sharp political divisions throughout this period. But also in his theory, extremely democratic. In fact, probably the one framer who's most consistently democratic in terms of thinking about the first principles of popular sovereignty, about consistently arguing for popular election of all the major political branches. So not just the lower house, the House of Representatives, but the Senate, and probably the presidency as well. He and Madison are, on a number of issues, are very much of a tag team. Sometimes cooperating, interestingly enough, with Charles Pinckney from South Carolina, who's a young and somewhat, well, I can't say smart alecky, but egomaniacal.
Was he in his 20s?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think he's still in his 20s. Yeah, I forget his birth date. So I think there's a lot of evidence that I think a lot of reason to infer that Madison and Wilson were, they're acting so often unison that it couldn't have been fortuitous or coincidental. They must have been, planning how to do it. Rufus King, one of whose direct namesake descendants I met by chance last night here, is a judge in Washington. Rufus King is in the Massachusetts delegation. Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris, when they're there, when he's there, are people. When Hamilton and Morris are there, are people you can imagine collaborating. Though Morris speaks more than anybody else, even though he's not there as long as others, and often goes off on his own. So he's a bit of a loose cannon, as in some ways was Hamilton. So
there were 3 non-signers.
right.
42 were there, 39 signed, 3 non-signers. And the reason I bring this up is that if you ask, I mean, I don't want to indict the whole group around here, but if you ask most people around here, who was the University of George Mason named after, and who was he, you often get blank stare.
Well, presumably the first question is easier than the second.
Who was he?
Who was Mason?
Yeah, who was George Mason and how important was he?
Mason's a fascinating guy. Mason, you can visit his plantation. Is just Gunston Hall. It's a wonderful house to visit.
20 minutes from here.
Yeah, not all that far from Mount Vernon. Mason was a kind of neighbor of George Washington's, an old political ally and friend of his. A very powerful mind, a person deeply steeped and deeply faithful to the whole radical Whig tradition of Anglo-American political theory, the kinds of people who had taken real strong positions against the Stuart Kings in the 17th century and try to keep that heritage alive in the 18th century. A guy who didn't really like politics all that much. He had a large family, he had 10 or 11 kids or something, and worried a lot about providing for them. So it was sometimes hard to get Mason to show up at the assembly, but when he was there, he was always a force to be reckoned with. He's well-known, should be well known in Virginia and elsewhere as the principal author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is probably the most important and influential of the Bills of Rights that the Americans attached to their first constitutions, which were the constitutions of the separate states framed at the time of independence. And at the convention, he plays a very active role, in many ways a very productive role. He's not a carping dissenter. But towards the end of the convention, he gets very disillusioned about a number of particular points. I think partly I think he's most concerned about the position of the South. I think he's most concerned about the initial minority position of the South, and he's also professes to be somewhat disturbed about the composition of the Senate, although he'd been a major player in terms of its
composition. Meaning what?
Well, how it would be elected,
either by the legislature.
It's going to be elected by the state legislatures, but Mason is one of the first to come up to start speculating about the idea that the Senate is really going to be too aristocratic a body, more aristocratic than he really wanted to be, and that it might be able to consolidate power. There's a lot of speculation in 1787, 1788 that, and I think Mason is a source of a fair amount of it, that the real locus of power in the new government would not be in the White House, or of course there was no White House at the time, would not be in the presidency or the House of Representatives, which is what Madison thought, but would really be in the Senate. And the reason for that was the Senate is the one branch of government that seems to have all 3 forms of power. It has the authority to legislate, it shares executive powers with the president in the form of the treaty power and the power to make appointments, and it has the kind of judicial power as the court of impeachments. And so there's this kind of image that the Senate is going to be the real locus of decision-making, is going to be too much insulated, too far removed from the real political life of the nation, too aristocratic, potentially oligarchic in its character. So Mason, gets a bee in his bonnet on these issues. I think throws in the absence of a Bill of Rights as a kind of rationalization or, another legitimating point for his opposition. So he's the most formidable of the 3 non-signers.
What would he more likely be politically if he were here today?
You mean would he vote Republican or Democratic?
Yeah.
Or oh, God knows. I mean historians try to stay away from
liberal, conservative. It's what's interesting is that so many party people today on both sides grab a hold of one of these and say it's the Jefferson-Jackson dinner, it's the Lincoln dinner, and all that. Right. And that's what I'm trying to get at. Is it?
Yeah. Well, of course, Brian. But one of the things in my book is in fact that is to kind of take the 18th century on its own terms, and to avoid the impulse to project, from 18th century attitudes into 20th century.
Well, let me reverse the question. Should people today not say I'm a Jeffersonian then?
Well, when we say we're Jeffersonians, we're really drawing upon many strands of, well, the multiple strands of Jefferson's whole persona. Are we Jeffersonians on public education? Are we Jeffersonians on state rights? Are we Jeffersonians on separation of church and state? Are we Jeffersonians out of a fundamental belief in participatory democracy? Are we Jeffersonians because we love architecture?
What about Madisonian? What would you be?
Well, I'm very much a Madisonian today, so I mean, I suppose I'll contradict myself, in one sense by saying.
But you're a Democrat, right?
I am a Democrat.
So a Madisonian would be a Democrat.
I'm not sure Madison would be a Cook County Democrat. That's the.
Would Jefferson be Thomas Jefferson be a Democrat?
Well, there's a lot of struggle over whose legacy. There's a famous story about Kennedy and Nixon. Did you know this? Theodore White tells this anecdote in his book, The Making the President, 1960, where Nixon was campaigning in the South and trying to portray himself as the true heir of Thomas Jefferson. And the basis of that, not implausible by any means, was the idea that the Republican Party, then as now, was much more of a states' rights kind of party in the classic way that Jefferson and Madison had fashioned the states' rights ideology a decade or so after the Constitution. And Kennedy had this wonderful response where he pulled out a quote from one of Jefferson's biographers, but actually a primary source from the 18th century, in which I forget who the observer was, but describes Jefferson as a man who can do all the many things Jefferson could do. Dance a minuet, plot an arc, design a building, do this, that, and the other thing. And then the punchline was, now what does Richard Nixon have in common with that? And the crowd, of course, would roar back as White tells the story, nothing. But there's the serious part of your question. If I can take this in a slightly different direction, I call myself a Madisonian, and one of the deep arguments in the book is that there was a fundamental element of Madison's thinking, which is thinking particularly about the problems of rights, which does provide a very powerful or very massive connection, substantive connection between the 18th century and the 20th century. Madison's whole theory of rights, circa 1787, 1788, how do you protect rights? Where does the danger to rights lie in a republic? Argues, I think with good reason, that the chief danger to rights is not going to come from a national government that's too powerful, as a lot of anti-federalists would have said. Instead, it's going to come from the processes of democratic politics as they're going to continue to operate within the states. And the real problem of protecting rights in the federal union will be to enable the national government to intervene within the individual states to protect individuals and minorities, and that's Madison's language, individuals and minorities, against the vicious, that's to say viceful, legislation that he thinks is still likely to be produced continually or periodically at the state level. That's why Madison wanted to give the national government an unlimited veto over all state laws, in part so it could protect itself from the interference of the states if states objected to national policy, but also so that the national government could intervene within the states in the name of protecting rights. And if you ask the question, what is the most interesting development in modern American constitutionalism? Basically, certainly since Brown, and arguably even earlier, Brown versus Board of Education, but arguably going back to the 1920s, it's the idea that federal courts have been able to incorporate, to use the preferred language, have been able to incorporate the Bill of Rights against the states through the 14th Amendment. That's a very Madisonian kind of outcome. That's to say, the whole principle, the whole theory of incorporation, that the federal courts have an obligation to enforce the National Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment against the states, is in a certain underlying sense extremely Madisonian in its substance. I happen to think Madison was right about that analysis on the whole. Was not completely right, but substantially right about that. So that's an entirely different way to bridge the gap from the 18th century to the 20th century. But really, as a historian, most of what I'm trying to do is explain what happened in the 18th century and let people in our own time draw the implications they will.
If someone buys your book, what do they get? What's in this? What's in this book? Give us kind of the parameters.
A short version of the contents? Well,
yeah.
Partly it's the story of how the Constitution was written. The first, first four chapters or so are basically a political story of what I call the road to Philadelphia, and then what happens at Philadelphia. What are the politics of the convention? But the deeper subject of the book is not to explain just how the Constitution was adopted, because that's an old story that we've known pretty well for a long time, but rather to use the 18th century debates to illuminate our own ongoing discussions about the theory of original intent, or what's sometimes called the theory of originalism. I framed this book in a way that I hope would provide a historically responsible account to a set of questions that recur in American constitutional jurisprudence and our constitutional theory more generally. There's been a lot of discussion for the last dozen years or so, but really even longer, about the idea that, about the proposition that when judges interpret the Constitution, one thing they should strive to do, or perhaps the most important thing they should strive to do, is to recover the original meanings or the original intentions or understandings underlying each of its clauses and provisions, whether we're talking about the 18th century Constitution or the Reconstruction Amendments. And what I set out to do in the book, Brian, was to kind of frame, was to say that that theory of interpretation, what's called the theory of originalism, or original intent jurisprudence, is essentially makes a set of claims about history. It says that we ought to be able to recover some set of fixed meanings. Some set of meanings was locked into the Constitution at the time when it was adopted. Our job is to recover what those meanings were and to apply them today. That's essentially a historical question you're raising. It says we ought to be able to recover what people thought they were doing in the past and what they meant, what they understood, what they intended. You can't answer that question without thinking about it in very explicitly historical terms. And I wrote the book largely not just to explain how the Constitution was adopted, which we already knew, but rather to explain why those kinds of appeals to the original intent or meaning or understanding are so difficult, sometimes so problematic, sometimes really that you're really left with very little. And yet, since they're so important, I wanted to kind of work out a way of answering those questions that would simultaneously allow us to understand what's the best, well, allow us to come up with what's the best story we can provide of how the Constitution was framed, and also what are its limits.
By the way, what do you get when you get a Pulitzer Prize besides the Pulitzer Prize winning Jack Rakove?
Well, there's a check. I'll find out tomorrow, but there's a luncheon.
How much do they give you,
Yeah, it's a $5,000 prize.
And you can spend that any way you want.
I think I'm going to buy a bike.
A bike?
Well,
a motorbike? Or
no, a motorbike. No, not a Harley. No, I turned 50 in about, let's say a week from tomorrow. And my ambition has been to get from the Stanford campus over to the ocean and back, which means crossing the mountains and getting back. I can get to the mountains overlooking the campus. That's not a problem. But I haven't done it twice. And so I think what I'd like is a technological boost that'll, I may have my basic mountain bike, so I'm thinking of getting either a hybrid or a road bike to kind of, give me the, the competitive edge to get over and back and still be able to walk the next day.
How long ago did you sell Knopf on doing a book like this?
Well, too long. It's kind of embarrassing, actually, to go back and see how many extensions in my contract I had to get. Knopf did my first book, and they had me on a kind of retainer, residual, whatever. And when I had the idea for doing this, I had the idea for doing this book a long time ago, but when I decided to go ahead with it, I think it's about 84, 85. So it was about a good dozen years from when a good decade or so, give or take, from when I signed the contract to when I finally turned in the manuscript in 95. The book was published a year ago now. A lot of my colleagues at Stanford have come up to me and said, it's nice to see someone say it took a long time to do something. Because the nature of some projects, especially I think historical kind of projects, historians prefer to write books, not just turn out papers. Some projects just take a long time to get it right, to get the story right.
Before you won the prize, how many did they print?
Let's see. The original printing was 7,000, and there have been 3 reprintings in increasing numbers since. Of course, the book's been in and out of bookstores. It's a little frustrating, I have to confess, because there weren't all that many copies available when the prize was announced. Of course, not that Knopf knew I was going to win the prize, and the paperback was already planned. So we had to play a little bit of catch-up to get the book redistributed.
Is the paperback out there now?
It's just coming out now. My wife actually saw it in a bookstore in Davis.
Davis, California?
Davis, California, last week. I have a few copies. It's about to be distributed. I'm not sure what the exact timetable is.
But you can still get a hardback.
Oh, yes, and I would prefer that you do.
And that hardback's $35?
$35.
Was that a tough price on a book like this?
Well, I guess I would have hoped for a little lower, but you know, I have no control over the pricing.
You've got in the book references to a lot of names that historians know, and even students hear from time to time. But I want to go down the list and have you just tell us.
Is this a memory test, or is it?
No, you'll know this inside and out. Who was Publius?
Oh, Publius is the pen name adopted by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, for writing the Federalist Papers. Going back, I think, to the classical figure of Valerius Publicola, I think is the origin.
Did they ever explain that, how they named it, their signature?
Not really. It's you know, it was the convention of the time to, you know, not to publish under your own name, but to, you know, to adopt a pseudonym, often, though not always, with classical overtones. And
how many Federalist Papers were there? How many?
Well, depending on how you count, there are 84 or 85. There's one that's, I forget which one. There's one that's been, I think, subdivided at some point, and so there's a slight ambiguity.
Where did they publish them?
They were originally published in the New York Journal, which is, I think, a thrice weekly paper in New York. They're substantially reprinted in other papers across the country, and then the first bound edition, the so-called McLean edition, comes out in the spring of 1788, and if I remember correctly, it includes the papers on the judiciary, which Hamilton writes, including the famous Federal 78, which is a statement of the theory of judicial review, which I think had not yet appeared in the newspapers.
Is there any way to relate what it was like back then and the value of the Federalist Papers to anything we see today?
In what sense?
In impact. In other words, did when they published them, did people read them? And
yeah, well, there's a lot of debate about their impact, and I think one would want to be cautious about ascribing too much importance to them. They're especially valuable to us, and they were certainly especially valuable to me, because they are the single most detailed, comprehensive, and I would argue lucid expositions of the Constitution that we have, and of course the fact that they're principally authored by Madison and Hamilton to give them all that much more impact. But the flip side of that is that precisely because there's so many essays, the series runs for so long, the arguments are in some cases so finely spun and you know, and so complicated, well, not complicated, but deep and rich, that I'm actually somewhat skeptical about the kind of impact they would have had at the time on ordinary readers and citizens. I think the one statement that matters most, and I make this point in the book, is a famous, much publicized public speech that James Wilson, you know, who I mentioned, you know, some time ago, the Pennsylvania delegate, the elitist Democrat, if you will. Wilson gives a public speech right outside the Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania State House, on October 6, 1787, and he makes a number of very strong statements, including why there's no need for a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, why a Bill of Rights would have been superfluous and pointless. And because Wilson was identified as a framer, you know, is not hiding behind a pseudonym, is speaking in public, and because his speech is regarded as a kind of authoritative early statement, and anti-federalists start jumping all over it within a matter of days. I think that's probably the one document, if you had to pull one document out of the whole ratification campaign, that had the greatest impact at the time. It's not Federalist 10, it's not Federalist 51, you know, the classic numbers everybody reads in college or sometimes even in high school. It's probably Wilson's public speech of October 6th.
Can you find that very often? I mean, is it published in a lot of these books?
Modern anthologies,
yeah.
Or yeah, it's pretty available now. It's there's a kind of standard source that's still in production, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, which is being published by the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. That actually is published in at least 2 of its volumes. I don't know if it's on the web yet. That would be an interesting question. You know, there are some websites which have important founding documents. I mean, there's one I was just looking at Yale Law School the other day, and I think Virginia has it. I think UVA has another one. But if it isn't there, it should be.
What would the framers think about the web?
Well, you know, maybe that's a good question to ask Newt Gingrich, since he has this whole, you know, he originally had this whole notion about, you know, the use of email, or, you know, the use of the web to kind of facilitate political communication. I think the framers were certainly in favor of the distribution of knowledge. I don't think there's any question about that. That they favored. They liked the idea of a free press. They wanted an educated citizenry. They wanted people to have access to information so that they could make up their minds in responsible ways and not simply act on prejudice. At the same time, there is in Madison and Wilson and Hamilton and Rufus King and others, there is a kind of subdued but significant skepticism about the ultimate capacity of the people at large to reach informed decisions about complicated questions. I mean, there is that deep conservative, anti-populist streak in the framers, and we shouldn't delude ourselves about it. Madison says as much in a letter he writes in January 1788, where he says, on most issues, most of the time, people simply have to follow the leader. They're better informed, social and intellectual, political superiors. So there's that kind of deep pessimism, a kind of doubt about whether or not most people at most points are willing to invest the time and energy to think through complicated issues.
Which framer would be happy with the fact that they can watch the debates on television, they can read all this information on the websites, they have, newspapers and all that? I mean, who would like that?
That's a good question. I haven't thought about this one. Off the top of my head, I might say Wilson. Even though Wilson was an elitist, as I said, what makes Wilson so interesting is this kind of juxtaposition of a kind of elitist politics, for which he was often parodied by his contemporaries, but also a kind of deep commitment to democratic principles, and not just as an abstract theory. I think Wilson had a deep sense, deeper, or kind of a deep intuition, that over the long run, the real character of the national government, especially the division of power between the nation and the states, would not be a function of the formal powers given to each, but really would ultimately depend on how well the people were satisfied by the kind of performance and the responsiveness that they would find in these different levels of government. And on that basis, I think Wilson is one who would say, well, a well-informed people would be best prepared to make those basic decisions about which levels of government are best prepared to function best.
How old was he during the Constitutional Convention?
Oh, how was Wilson? Wilson's born in the 1740s, so he's
47.
He comes to America about right in the mid-1760s. He'd finished his studies in Scotland at that point. So I would assume Wilson, I'd have to look it up, but I think Wilson at that point was probably in his early 50s, would be my guess. Late 40s, early 50s.
And you say he was an elitist. Define the term elitist back then. What would that mean?
Well, I think in terms of the way the political controversy of the Revolution play out, I think one way to define it would be to kind of follow up on the point I was just trying to make. The extent to which one, really in some ways then is now, the extent to which one is skeptical about the capacity of the masses of the people
But did he live
to
an
make
elitist
informed
life?
judgments. I'm sorry?
Was he rich?
He was certainly ambitious. Wilson comes over. He's a successful attorney in Philadelphia. He attaches himself to the group of commercial interests, mercantile interests around the figure of Robert Morris, people who have big commercial ambitions of their own. He's much tied in with the Bank of North America, which is the first real bank founded in Philadelphia, which is thought of as a kind of quasi-monopolistic institution that a lot of people resented. And then Wilson has this kind of sad story at the end of his life. When he's on the Supreme Court, he gets heavily invested in land speculations, which are all, especially in the late 18th and the 19th century, were always very tempting to Americans and always very dangerous. Because it's easy to get land, but it's hard to settle it, and it's hard to settle in a way that'll make it profitable before your debts start piling up. And Wilson gets in too deep, and he goes bankrupt, and he flees Philadelphia, flees his creditors, goes off somewhere in the Carolinas where he's finally tracked down and brought back to debtor's prison. So he really dies. I think he dies about 1795, 1796, something like that. But he really dies a broken man. I mean, kind of broken in body and spirit and finances as well. So there's a kind of pathos, to his story.
Was he on the first Supreme Court?
Yeah, he's on the first Supreme Court.
A couple of quick names. Brutus.
Brutus. Well, Brutus is a leading anti-federalist. pamphleteer. There are some hunches, but none definitive as to who his identity might have been.
And what's the best way of defining an anti-federalist?
Oh, an anti-federalist. The anti-federalist is the conventional name given to the time and since to the opponents of the Constitution. That's to say, to those who opposed its ratification or who at least felt that its ratification should be hedged about by significant amendments at a very early, if not immediate point.
Recognizable names that were anti-federalists.
Well, they tend to be less the household names than the Federalists, but the three most recognizable the two most recognizable at the get-go would be George Mason, who we talked about earlier, and Elbridge Gerry, who's the non-signer from Massachusetts, Luther Martin, who had been behind Madison at Princeton.
They were all delegates.
In his college days. Yeah, Martin's one of the delegates who leaves early, a kind of militant states' rightist of the First Order, a very important politician in Maryland. George Clinton, the governor of New York, Patrick Henry in Virginia. Clinton and Henry were probably two of the most successful politicians in terms of having big popular followings. Richard Henry Lee in Virginia.
His relationship to Robert E. Lee?
There's a cousinry there. Robert E. is not a direct descendant, I think.
Let me go back, though, to you named Elbridge Gerry and George Mason and then Edmund Randolph, the three non-signers of the Constitution.
I skipped over Randolph because he winds up being a Federalist. Randolph's a trimmer. He goes back and forth, winds up finally supporting the Constitution.
But the non-signers, what was it like being there, do you think? If 39 signed, 3 didn't. Were they all in the room when they said, no, I'm not signing that thing?
I talk about this in one of the chapters. I kick off by talking about, after Fitzsimons, it's the same chapter where my son Daniel counted the steps, and Fitzsimons is dashing upstairs, and then Fitzsimons tells the assembly that he'd like to stick around. He tells the assembly that the Pennsylvania delegates be happy to all come upstairs and tell them all about the convention now, except that the delegates have scheduled a dinner, a kind of getaway or farewell dinner that evening, and after 4 months they were anxious to leave Philadelphia, so there was a farewell dinner, and I speculate in the book. I don't know what happened. I assume Gerry, Mason, and Randolph all went. I assumed that because they were 18th century gentlemen, everybody was polite, but there must have been a certain kind of strain because the last day of the convention, Franklin gives a famous speech which becomes a big part of Federalist literature.
How old was he then?
Oh God, Franklin is in his upper 80s at that point. Franklin was fairly feeble at this time. Most of his speeches have to be read for him by Wilson.
James Wilson.
James Wilson, yeah.
He was a delegate, Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah. Franklin's a delegate. I think he attended pretty regularly. But
Elbridge Gerry, the famous gerrymandering phrase, in his life, he went on to be vice president. When did he get the...
No, gerrymandering, well, it's Elbridge Gerry, but gerrymandering.
Same guy, though.
Yeah, same guy, yeah. Well, he had a long career. He had a long political career, too. I mean, he ends his life as Madison's vice president. Actually, I think, if I remember correctly, he dies in office. Gerrymandering is...
Why'd they change it, by the way?
It takes place when Gerry is gerrymandering takes place when Gerry is the governor of Massachusetts, and I think sometime in the end of the first decade of the 19th century.
Why did they change it from Gerry to Jerry?
Who knows? But I know it's Gerry because I had a namesake descendant years ago as a student when I taught at Colgate. So. And
Edmund Randolph, he's the third one that didn't sign it, was what then?
Randolph was then the governor of Virginia. Goes on to become Attorney General and then briefly Secretary of State under Washington.
Time goes by too fast in this thing. You never get enough done. Go back to your own education. You grew up in Chicago.
Okay.
Where did you go to school?
Well, after I left Evanston High School, I went off to Haverford College. Also spent a year at the University of Edinburgh. So I graduated, or I should say I was graduated from Haverford in 1968, tumultuous year. Spent a little time in the Army at Fort Knox and then started as a reservist, and then I started graduate school at Harvard in 1969.
What did you get your dissertation in? Or what did you do it in?
Well, I did early American history. I did, my first book was, in some ways, it's the prequel to, as we say in California, to this book. It's a history of the Continental Congress called The Beginnings of National Politics, which Knopf published in 1979.
Is there anybody in your life that you point to besides your own father or parents or whatever when you grew up that made a difference in steering you in the direction of being a scholar on the Constitution?
Yeah, well, there is one not fairly obscure scholar who I usually invoke in this context. I'm a student of Bernard Bailyn.
And who is that?
Who is the now retired, well, held various chairs at Harvard University, but is one of the 2 or 3 preeminent scholars of early American history and in this century, and for my money, far and away the best.
And did you have him as a professor?
Well, when I went off to graduate school at Harvard in '69, I had no interest in early American history. I don't think the thought of studying the 18th century had never crossed my mind. But Bailyn was, probably the most interesting, certainly the most stimulating person to work with at Harvard. And then I realized that the general kinds of questions I knew I wanted to ask about American politics, about the relationship between politics and political ideas, were in some ways better asked, or even best asked, about the period in which Bailyn was then working very intently, the period of the Revolution. So it was a kind of fortuitous. There are some fortuitous elements to it, but
one last thing, I got to ask you about this. You allude to the fact in there, or you say it's the fact that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence as if he wanted to hear it read versus the Constitution.
Yeah.
I mean, read aloud. I mean,
right.
Why?
Well, that's not an argument of mine. I have a colleague of mine at Stanford, Jay Fliegelman, published a book a couple years ago. Stanford Press published, called "Declaring Independence." And the point of departure for the book is there's an early printing of the Declaration which has these curious marks in it, kind of curious punctuation marks in funny places. It doesn't make any sense. Jay's theory, and that of a couple other scholars, is that in fact those marks are kind of diacritical accents to indicate how the thing should be read aloud. And so my colleague, Jay Fliegelman, then ties this into larger discussions about the nature of rhetoric and public and private expressions of personality in the 18th century. So in fact, I'm giving him a plug there, more than myself.
This is what the book looks like. It's called Original Meanings, published by Knopf, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and our guest has been Jack Rakove. Thank you very much.
Thank you.